A very good morning, afternoon or evening, and a welcome to everyone watching online through Zoom or through YouTube. My name is Melissa Leach. I'm director here at IDS, and I'm absolutely delighted to welcome you to the IDS annual lecture, which is the flagship event in our calendar. It's when we welcome a top global leader, thinker and doer to the Institute. And this year, of course, we're doing it online. So it's an extraordinary year where the world's been facing a global pandemic at the same time as major challenges of climate and environmental change, social inequality. We've got the COP26 on climate change coming up next year, and just 10 years until the deadline of the UN global goals. At this moment, I couldn't be more honoured to welcome somebody who has become an extraordinary leader around these interconnected issues. So our guest speaker today is none other than His Excellency President Carlos Alvarado, the 48th President of the Republic of Costa Rica. He was inaugurated into office on May the 9th, 2018. He's a professor, a politician, and an author. He studied journalism originally at the University of Costa Rica. He holds a master's degree in political science from that university and a master's in development studies from IDS at the University of Sussex. We're incredibly proud that he is one of our own alumni. He's an expert in communication, in public policy, and public-private partnerships, with 5 years of experience in political communication and a variety of parliamentary advisory roles. And he had a number of government positions before becoming president, including Minister of Human Development and Social Inclusion, Executive President of the Joint Social Welfare Institute, and Minister of Labour and Social Security. So who could be in a better position to talk about these challenges of building back better with environmental sustainability and inclusion? He's joined in discussion today by another extraordinary leader and also another ex-IDS colleague, Farhana Yamin. Farhana is an internationally recognized environmental lawyer. She's a climate change and development policy expert, and she's advised vulnerable developing countries in climate change negotiations for the last 25 years. She's published numerous books and articles on the nexus of development and climate change. She's just been named in BBC Radio 4's Women's Hour Power List of 30 women making a significant positive contribution to the environment and the sustainability of our planet, who call her a powerhouse of climate justice. She previously worked at IDS as a fellow, helping to establish a lot of our research on climate change and development. And she continues to provide legal, strategy and policy advice to NGOs, foundations and developing nations on international climate change negotiations. So I think with our pair of speakers today, we cannot but be guaranteed a truly insightful, illuminating and important lecture and discussion. We've got some special guests here with us as well. So I'd like to welcome in particular Ambassador Ortiz, who's the Costa Rica ambassador to the UK, Baroness Hooper, who is the Prime Minister's trade envoy to Costa Rica, and Georgina Butler, the British ambassador to Costa Rica. So welcome to all of you. And finally, just a few quick notes before we start. As you will already be seeing, we have English Sign Language interpretation going on from Susan Booth and Mark Schofield. So welcome, thank you in advance to them. If you're on Twitter, please tweet enthusiastically using the hashtag IDS Lecture and follow us on Twitter at IDS UK. And we will, of course, have time for your own questions and comments. So to do that, please put your questions either in the chat if you're on Zoom or in the comments box on YouTube, and we'll be addressing a selection in the Q&A. But without further ado, it's now over to His Excellency the President to deliver his lecture. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melissa, and thank you all. Thank you to both ambassadors, to the Baroness, saying hi also to Farhana Yamin, and also thanking Susan Booth for the translation. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here and to have an opportunity to give a small talk, a small lecture to you all. Actually, it's quite exciting. 11 years ago, I delivered one short lecture with Sir Richard Jolly on Costa Rican development while I was a student. And well, IDS was quite an experience for me. And when I was thinking about what to tell you, especially students and alumni, I wanted to talk to development practitioners and to young people, and what we can do in today's world. Also thinking that being young is something more of the heart than of the body. And I want to share a few slides with an important disclaimer. Um, Usually I don't talk a lot about myself, but in this case, I'm going to make an exception, particularly because from my experience, development practitioners tend to be completely the opposite to selfish people. We tend to work for the others. But in today's world, I believe that I want to share a little bit about what my path has been for the past years, and it might find something of interest and something you might relate, and hopefully something that could add value in your careers and in your lives. So I've named this presentation What Development Practitioners and Young Leaders Can and Must Do, and I will add in today's world, a world that's been hit by COVID-19. We have the challenges of climate change, the challenges of social inequality in a world that's trying to build up through multilateralism. So I want to talk a little bit about it. So first slide, I put this because many people think that when you become a president, that's something you wanted ever since you were a child. But ever since I was a child, really, what I really want to be was a baseball player. This is me on the pitch in Costa Rica. So my dreams were related to baseball. And given that Costa Rica is not very good at baseball, then I thought that being a goalkeeper might be the next thing to do. But I really never thought about this. It was never my dream to become the president of my country. My dream was about playing games, baseball, or being the goalkeeper. Eventually, when I started growing up, my dreams were about writing, being a writer, and helping others through that. Those were my true dreams, being able to help others. The funny thing is that baseball gave me something that really influenced me. I used to be the catcher of the team. And if you think about it, in a baseball pitch, the catcher is the only player when you're on the defense that is watching the whole team. It's the only one that's looking the other way. Has the possibility to direct other players, to move the defense. Also, is the only player that has the chance to go and speak to the pitcher and talk to the pitcher. And even when I was a child, many times I found myself being more a therapist than a player, talking to my pitcher, telling him stories of was important for him to do the pitch, or telling him to calm down or to cheer up. So that gave me a different vision. And I carry that with me, uh, having the whole view of the game. But at that time, I was not thinking about becoming what eventually happened and what I've become. Being able to be a catcher gave me the vision of the game. Similarly, I never wanted to be the front man. Being a catcher gives you the possibility actually to be the guy on the back. You can help a lot, you can do lots of things, but it's other guys who tend to be on the spotlight. So I never really wanted to be the front guy. But when I was in high school, my friends and we started building a rock and roll band in those years. So my plan was to buy myself a bass guitar. I love bass guitars. I love playing the bass, but it gives you the opportunity to be safely on the back, backing up the rest of the band. So my strategy was to become a bass player, be on the back of the band, and be supportive of it. Then one of my best friends called me one day and he said, "Hey, hey, Carlos, you know, my dad bought me a bass guitar. So I said to myself, well, it's not that usual. You have two bass players in one rock and roll band. So then I said, well, I'm going to buy myself a guitar. And then my other friend called me and say, hey, you know what? I'm getting a guitar for Christmas. And I said, well, that's great, you know. So that was for my plan of being a bass player or guitar player. So when we gather up, the question is, well, we have the drums, we have the bass, we have the guitar, but who's going to sing? So then that's how I became the guy that sang. And I became the frontman, not without wanting it, but because out of necessity. And I really did not want it to be on front. It's quite, might be sometimes scary. And then something expected of frontmans. But I end up there, and also gave me the possibility to somehow lead the band. Why? Because if you have teenagers trying to play together, it might be not that easy. Everybody's trying to play in their own solo. So this experience all pushed me. It pushed me into new directions, even though I did not want it to be the front guy. And I played music for around 12 years, from being a teenager into my 20s, and record some albums. And it was a great experience. But it was funny because I never ambitioned that. But it made me grow a lot. I grew a lot because of that. And it's an experience I cherish. I don't play that much anymore, but whenever I have the chance, I play with my friends one or two times a year. Not in COVID times though. And yes, it pushed me into different directions. I My dream was to contribute, to help Costa Rica. That was always my dream. Um, to, to to propel our full capacity of human development. And that's why I applied for the Chevening Scholarship. And I was lucky enough to end up in Sussex and in IDS, when some of you guys are right now. It was one of the best, if not the best experience of my life. And what they call networking sometimes ended up being a network of friends and of love and of experiences and of memories that really influenced me. To tell the truth, it was on IDS about 12 years ago that for the first time I saw how passionate many people were about climate change and the climate crisis. At that time, I was really focused on poverty issues, taking people out of, or working with them to grow them out of poverty. But I was not really engaged on climate change. And at the first, I thought to myself, well, these guys are passionate about it. Um, but it was because I did not fully understand the impact on the planet and on humanity, on generations. And that was something IDS gave me. Similarly, with the passion on gender and gender equality, on gender studies, that really influenced me a lot. So you might know this. So my first essay, being on IDS, was on Robert Chambers and the great Robert Chambers and his definition of development as good change. So I thought to myself, well, this is going to be easy, talking about good change, quite straightforward. But then when you deep dive on it, it appears to be more complicated than only that. It has to do with what is good and what is change. But anyway, I thought this is going to be quite a piece of cake, but it ended up not being a piece of cake. In my first essay on IDS, I got a C minus. The first time I was a bit discouraged, but then I learned that it was not the essays that counted, but what you learn out of your experience and out of what you read and out of what you talk with people. When I was earlier in my studies, I always was on the top of my class, and not necessarily my times of IDS. I have to mention as well, I get sometimes diverted on the pubs on Brighton, but that's not necessarily an excuse. But I learned a lot, and I started relating things. Change is about creation, like in art and like in music. You create new things, you study them, you come up with solutions, with new things. So I started thinking about development and change as another way of creating. But then I understood that in many cases, to achieve change, to make change happen and possible, you need to get involved to another level. And in my case, I thought it was the political level, because it was not enough to influence the leaders, but to be there and to make change happen and possible. And I also like this quote from Peter Drucker: the best way to predict your future is to create it. And I believe that's what we're doing with all the policies of decarbonization uh, to tackle the climate crisis. Also, the policies of human development of the goals of 2030. That's what we're doing, building our own future. But in order for that to happen, I understood you need to get involved in things. You cannot just wait to happen for those things to happen or to influence certain leaders. As we've seen recently, they might not be so responsive to what people have to say and to what young people have have to say. And what is good? Good change. Well, I think it has to do a lot with values, but also with empathy, with love. I mean, development in politics for change ought to have love, empathy. Those are the values that should put us. Equality, being empathic with the future generation for them to have a better planet. And that gives you a lot of sense of purpose. The great Ray Bradbury, who wrote the Martian Chronicles, he had a saying, very simple one, but profound: do what you love and love what you do. Being that the key for success. And that has a lot to do with purpose. So I got involved in 2014 after a political campaign in which I got involved. I was appointed as the minister in cabinet. I was the youngest minister in cabinet. At the time, I was 34, and I was the minister of human development. And my task was to develop a plan to tackle poverty. So I have to say those 2 years were the very, very exciting years. We work a national plan to reduce poverty. We introduced the multidimensional poverty index, working together with Oxford University. In this plan, we put together the whole system digitally to take care of those who were the poorest and the most vulnerable. So the whole system was to take care with from children, women, young people to the elderly within a same system to give a more uh, comprehensive approach to tackle human development. Before that, it was done, let's say, manually. So poor people have to go to the bureaus, to the offices, looking for the services. So you were re-victimizing them. Instead, the system was to approach people on the field, working with them, giving them tools, education, cash transfers, but also opportunities. So this was a great and exciting time. I really love this experience, one of my best. Those are women that used to be in poverty getting their degrees because it involved lots of lots of education, lots of empowering women, economic empowerment, and also empowerment on how they perceive themselves, because there's a lot of violence and a lot of aggression in those parts of the population. So it was a great time. But then the president requested me to change, and he moved me to the Ministry of Labor. So there I was with 36 years being the Minister of Labor of Costa Rica. And that was interesting because it had to that was talking and working with the unions and part of the politics a lot, and I learned that a lot. But then something happened, particularly in 2016, and I do believe we all might have experienced that, but something was wrong at the time. Um, the U.S. election occurred in that year, which really, I believe, shook the world. Brexit, Colombia peace referendum, where the no won against the peace agreement at the time. And we were about to get into an election in Costa Rica in 2018. The thing that struck me the most was that for the first time in Costa Rica, the candidates that were leading the polls were those who have very extreme populist positions against same-sex marriage, taking Costa Rica out of the Inter-American Human Rights Court, closing the Institute of Women, very repressive perspectives. And it was quite scary at the time. It was indeed. And my party did not have a candidate. And nobody was going to run from our candidate. Nobody was going to hold our ticket. And I found that unacceptable. So then I started looking from my own experiences, having the vision of the whole game. I knew what the game was about and what was at stake, also because we were heading to a fiscal default if we did not act quickly. I know our democracy was at stake. I know the rights of women and gay people were on the line. I knew that at the time, but still we had no candidate. So I felt pretty much when we were building up the band, there was nobody to take the front line. So I decided to run. And basically I said to myself, it doesn't matter if I win or not. It matters if I stand for the right things. From the very start, I was very clear. Even Costa Rica is a Latin American country that has certain levels of being conservative. I was very clear about allowing and propelling same-sex marriage, defending women's rights. We have now a paritary cabinet, have men, have women. Defending, actually, during campaign, I spoke about taxes, raising taxes, facing populism, because that was the reality. We were heading to default. Because change was required. I had the vision because I knew the game. There was need for leadership and nobody was standing up. And change, good change and values were required. So I ran. On the first part, we were second with 21% of support, and one of the evangelical candidates gained 26% of the vote. And then on the second round, we won by a 60%, which was good. But it was because the country realized there was a lot in the line, democracy and many other values. And one of the great things about it was when you talk to a diverse family, being a gay marriage or gay parents with their children, or a mother with a transgender girl or boy that come reach and talk to you, they say, thank you. We felt our democracy embraces us as well. So that's what I believe practitioners of development should do as well. Get involved. And sometimes, as we are selfless. We want to serve others. But perhaps we not necessarily get involved at that level. And I do believe in these times it is required to get a certain degree of involvement. It could be grassroots, it could be communication, it could be politics, but we need to get involved. So this is me with which the women that used to be my Minister of Finance. That's the night that we passed the law on fiscal reform. Costa Rica was days about to be on default, and that will have been terrible. And we managed to prove that. And talking about taxes is the most unpopular thing. I became really unpopular since that, because we had to raise taxes. But in order to keep the education working, to keep the social programs working, to keep a social welfare state alive. So that happened. Then we defended the right of the gay community. And even though the religious part of Costa Rica and the conservative part, they were really against us, and they had a majority on Congress, we managed to establish the egalitarian marriage, which became a symbol of inclusion in Costa Rica. That was not easy, but as I say again, whenever somebody feels more included because of this, is something that's good change, I believe. It's good change. Also, on February 2019, this is me with Claudia, my wife, and Cristiana Figueres, who was the chair of the Paris Agreement. She is a Costa Rican. On February 2019, we launched our decarbonization plan. And our decarbonization plan was the first of the world. And this has the 10 pillars so can Costa Rica achieve in 2050 being a zero emissions country, completely decarbonized economy, thinking about new jobs and thinking on 10 pillars and 10 dimensions in which we can achieve that. So those are the kinds that we were expecting. We talk a lot about in campaign about those. Because when you talk in campaign, that's your contract with citizens. Those we were expecting. This is the 10 pillar plan, and I encourage you Rica decarbonization plan. You can go through it, but it has transportation, agriculture, industry going. Are very low. We have 50% of forest coverage, and in the next years we're going to increase our protection of the oceans from 2% to 30%, in line with the Ambition Coalition, which we lead for this purpose. But when you run for president or for office, you're not expecting a pandemic to occur. And indeed it happened. And we were economically recovered because of the fiscal reform, but then it hit us very hard. And I'm talking about the countries from all the region and all around the world. Costa Rica has a universal healthcare system that has about 80 years old. It's quite similar than the NHS in the UK. So we went from having on March, and I believe that the information is there, but we have just less than 50 intensive care units for people to be treated in the case of COVID. So we started implementing restrictions. We increased our capacity of intensive care units. And the good thing is we have not, since the pandemic began, reached a saturation on the units of intensive care. That means that no person in Costa Rica has been left out on having the possibility of having a respirator or the appropriate treatment during COVID-19. Also, our fatality rates, I'm going to read that from here because it's too small. Yeah, our deaths are now about 1,600, and see, well, I can't reach the lethality rates, but those are one of the lowest in the region and I believe in the world. So basically, my key message is that there is not one kind of leadership. I mean, leadership is also diverse. You don't have to feel that you need to be in somebody else's shoes to lead. You have to develop they say it's not very good to sound. Okay, so leadership, it's not about a model of leading. You have to create your own voice. You have to embrace your own path. Make the best out of your own experiences. I believe that was my case. I never thought that I'll be in this position, but life and my values and what I believe in leaded me into this direction. And I believe that for young people, what matters most, and for development practitioners, is to always have courage. Courage is very important because doing the right thing is not easy. It tends to be usually very hard. Also have a lot of empathy with people and also lots of love. That makes all the difference, and it has made it for me. So I'll stop there with this small account of events, and I'll be glad to establish a conversation with Madam Jameen, but also with people in IDS and in many places. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was a truly inspiring talk, and I think your key messages at the end around love and empathy and that values orientation are messages for all of us, whether we're young or not so young. So let me now turn over to Farhana and leave the two of you to have some discussion around the issues that have arisen from your talk.
Okay, thank you. Is my video on, and is the sound okay from this end?
Yeah, wonderful.
Thank you. Well, Your Excellency, what an amazing tour de force of your personal journey. You know, we were at IDS. I was there, I think, at around that time. You know, you've given us such a lecture which is really inspiring, helping to bring those fundamental values of love, of courage, of empathy, and shown how in your own life, you know, very reluctantly maybe, perhaps you've ended up as president and used all of those things to exemplify an approach to a whole of government approach that is truly inclusive, that is also tackling, you know, climate change in the emergency way that is necessary. I am just absolutely thrilled and delighted that IDS has picked up the gauntlet of bringing at the end of this year, as we reflect on how the different crises, the climate crisis, the financial crisis that hasn't really gone away actually for a decade, the economic crisis, the social inequalities that are now so obvious and present a social crisis, how all of those are linked and how we can tackle them together, and the way that your country is trying to do that, despite not being, you know, one of the wealthiest countries in the world, despite all of the challenges that you've faced, is really astounding. So I want to congratulate you on your spectacular success in helping unite your country and bringing it together, and for presenting your decarbonization plan a full year ahead before many laggard countries have done that. I know that the summit that is going to be held in a couple of weeks' time, convened by the UK presidency with the UN Secretary General and the Italian presidency, which is with the Italians who are sharing some of the responsibilities of the COP26 presidency. I hope very much that Costa Rica will be given a major platform to present its vision. I want to ask you a couple of questions, and would love to know, you know, what keeps you going at this time? Many of us have felt a sense of despair. I myself have stepped back from the international negotiations a little bit because, you know, it seems we're on track at the moment to be nearer 3 degrees than the 1.5 degrees that the Paris Agreement, you know, said was our goal. And I want to know, in these times when, you know, countries such as your own are facing such colossal economic losses. You know, I read a figure that in April of this year, the Costa Rican economy, which is heavily reliant on tourism, lost 350 million US dollars. How are you grappling with the scale of those challenges? How are you keeping yourself and your country inspired and going? Just wondering if we've lost you, or is the sound okay?
Question. I do believe. Well, when I was in IDS, there was something I heard a lot, even though I did not deep dive on it, which was complexity theory, and I believe these times do comply with that definition. Let me put an example. We currently in Central America are experiencing COVID-19, high unemployment due to COVID-19, and then just recently, 2 weeks ago, we were hit by 2 hurricanes, which were more extreme in their effects due to climate change, Hurricane Eta and Hurricane Iota. So, and those are going to affect the poorest of the region. Those are going to trigger migrations, particularly to the United States, are going to affect crops and production, and may raise inequality. And the poorest household in the region are the ones led by women. So if you want to think about it, you cannot see it only in one dimension. It's a very complex scenario that we're living in. So I do believe that, for example, in the case of negotiations for climate change, currently we need to think at the same time on the international targets to reduce emissions and not to reach the levels of the increases of temperature. But then if we want that to happen, we need to address the finance of the emerging and the poor economies. Because if not, the priorities in the developing world are going to be elsewhere. I mean, the discussion about climate change is not going to be on top of the list. Not because we do not want to, but let me tell you what, as a pretty common debate in Costa Rica, when we talk about electric buses and electric vehicles and an electric train, which are going to decarbonize our transportation, that's our strongest footprint, many people, opposition, keeps telling us, but why do you talk about that? You need to talk only about jobs. And if you need to pollute more to create jobs, that's okay. And you say, no, it's not. So that's the kind of debate we are having now. we need to see what the policy of the new administration in the United States is going to, how it's going to implement what they are talking about currently. But so far, it appears to be encouraging. But I do believe that, for example, still in the last G20 summit that just recently occurred, I think it's still, we need to go further as a planet if we want to address climate change. We held here in Costa Rica the pre-COP just last year, and we were very excited because we were pushing for more ambition. But well, we need to understand how COVID is not a setback for that ambition, but how we can manage to to work together with in both fronts at the same time.
Absolutely, and I understand. I understand. I mean, one of the things that is happening to countries like Costa Rica, other vulnerable countries, you know, especially smaller countries that don't have the economic reserves, you know, the financial reserves, is this massive debt crisis, which is building up again. It's never really gone away, but it's building up again. And, you know, many of the islands experience, you know, hurricanes, typhoons that, you know, wipe out double digits from their economies. And that is likely to be compounded and increase. And yet our COP, I have to say, is not going to be looking at loss and damage in a big way. It's yet again being shunted off to a technical discussion, postponed, minimized. And sadly, you know, even in the UK, we have a government that is looking at, you know, cutting the 0.7% target, which has, you know, left many people feeling frustrated on how the UK can express its solidarity, express its leadership, express its support to vulnerable countries, to all developing countries who have historically not caused this problem. You know, your own country, as you know, is, I think, is 0.02%. It's not even 1%. It's like 1%. You're a big emitter, by the way. You know, you're a tiny fraction. And I wonder what you think. You know, you can now say and do in the coming 12 months to put the real kind of solidarity, the real way in which international empathy might express itself. What are your ideas for trying to do that? I'm at a loss, frankly. I feel I've been bashing my head against the brick wall, you know, on some of these agenda items. So I'd love to hear what your thoughts and new ideas are.
Thanks, because it gave me the opportunity to share. Recently, past September, on the General Assembly of the United Nations, we launched an initiative. Costa Rica launched it within a group called by the Secretary General Guterres and led by Jamaica and Canada, but a Costa Rican initiative called FACE. And it's an acronym for Fund to Alleviate COVID Economics. So what it's about is it proposes that the 20 countries with the largest GDP gather up funds equivalent to their 0.7% of their GDP. And with that, you can create a fund to finance the rest of the countries of the world in a percentage equivalent to 3% of their GDP. And with that, having that fund, also providing loans, long-term loans, we're talking about 40, 50 years, fixed tax rates. With this, you manage to finance many of the transformations that derive from COVID-19, but also into sustainability and into inclusion. So with this initiative phase, it's a way of cheap financing the emerging economies and the poor economies. It sounds, well, it sounds easy, but it's a matter of the will, particularly of the big economies. But the argument here, and the good thing here, is that the solidarity in this case, and even the selfishness in this case, can be aligned. Why? Because the crisis of COVID-19 it's not going to be over in the whole world or until there's a vaccine and a sanitary solution for the whole world, but also a financial solution for the whole world. Uh, Large economies and developed countries sell their goods and trade with the poor and emerging economies as well. And if our economies are not healthy, well, there's not going to be enough growth, if you want to think it in that term, in those terms. But also, if the developing world is get hit harder with COVID and climate change, as I mentioned, with unemployment, but also with extreme climates, you're going to have the increase of migrations that mostly go to developed countries to look for employment. You're going to have an increase on drug trafficking and on human trafficking, because those are major markets that provide, it sounds terrible, but those have more resources in cash, and you can see it across Latin America. And sometimes you find yourself competing in the neighborhoods, particularly in the poorest neighborhoods, providing opportunities vis-a-vis the opportunities that the drug cartels provide. So those are the kinds of things that we need to tackle. And for that, only global cooperation and multilateralism is the only way around. I mean, there's no one country that can alone fix their own problems and the problems of the others. In this, we need to work together as a team, such as in baseball, such as in a rock band, it's the same. You need to work together as a team, and we need to work together as a team, as a planet. And so we need to wait what the new administration in the US is going to look like. And I believe that if it goes in that direction, we can see a shift of the tides and hopefully have different results.
I hope so. I hope so. I feel a sense of a renewal of that more unified approach, a reaffirmation of the value of the multilateral system. You know, as we go into next year, as we look at how can we achieve the sustainable development goals, how can we really protect nature? We have a deferral also of the biodiversity convention meetings. We have obviously the 1 year gap now in the submission of the NDCs, which are the national action plans, which are on their 5-yearly resubmission and updating. And for those who are slightly nerdy, this is the real test of Paris. The test of Paris is whether countries will accept their legal obligation to submit, frankly, more ambitious plans that put them on track with the 1.5 and well below 2 degrees targets, as well as completing the other sort of more technical rules. So I do feel a sense of, with the election and with the world realizing that global cooperation is needed, whether it's for vaccinations, whether it's for dealing with these now colossal events. But I feel at the same time, more and more countries are becoming more selfish, and the inequalities, you cited 0.7% from the 20 countries that are the richest would fund 3% of GDP, in the rest. A parallel also individually is that you have, I think, 2,153 billionaires on the planet who have a combined wealth of more than 4.6 billion. And it's that scale of social and economic inequality which seems to be really difficult to tackle. So I want to sort of probe you a bit and think, how can we tackle these inequalities better, given that there are ever increasing, widening of the fortunes, frankly, of the rich and the poor, whether it's at the country level or whether it's at the individual level?
Well, I currently, even though so complex scenario, I think there's lots of hope. And as they say, as Cristiana Figueres says, I'm an stubborn optimist. we need to be stubborn about optimism. So I have hope, and I am optimistic about what's going to come. Um, I think for inequality, the best thing you can tackle currently around the world, from my approach, has to do with we should focus a bit less, and only a bit less, um, on money and on earnings, and we need to focus on access to, in some cases, to very simple things such as water and electricity, but particularly on connectivity, particularly in being connected, because inclusion now means to be included not only in a society, but within a global society. And I think we need to underline the importance of education and of knowledge, because in today's world, ability to be connected and to have access to what's going on, it's a trampoline, it's a way to reduce inequalities. Um, Also, we need to look into and I think into the tax systems, but also then again in the cultural shift that capitalism is having now, of rethinking the societies and thinking more about well-being and not only about income or growth. And that, I believe that the idea as a virus has already been installed in many societies. I think in Europe it's growing. That idea is growing at a fast rate, and it's going to take some time. But then the approach of growth, only GDP and only income, might be shifting, or at least contested, with an approach on well-being and more on happiness and on health. So, and I can perceive that the next generation, that's why it's so important, the young people are going to have a great impact on how we address climate change and other of the problems. But that's why it's important to get involved, because we need to shape the world that we want to live in. And this is not going to happen just because, and I've seen in Europe how elections have turned because of how people are being very vocal about the climate change issues. Also, I've seen why populism has emerged, mostly, I believe, because of inequality. People that feel excluded are sometimes the ones that support the more extreme candidates. So, but still, I remain hopeful. And that's why the agenda of inclusion, we should not let that out of the equation. Inclusion is key. Women, people in poverty, migrants, inclusion is key, because if we don't work that part of the agenda, well, I believe we've seen it, but it can backfire the system. So we need to work on inclusion as well.
Fantastic. Well, thank you. And you've shown in your own work how you can bring different sides together. And I read a little bit about, the work that you did as a Labour minister to bring many different factions and to agree something which on the face of it looked very difficult to agree. So maybe there's something in what we all learned, from the participation team at IDS, on these new participatory approaches. I'm certainly trying to use and support citizens' juries, people's assemblies, sortition, which is, a relatively new concept, but is really what the Athenian democracy was based on, that, citizens can be chosen on the basis of random lots to come and make decisions. And I feel like more and more countries are using these kind of more participatory techniques to solve, bigger and bigger problems where you need everyone to be on board. But thank you so much for that. I leave you with one reflection, and you can answer it later, because I know there's loads of questions coming up, and I want to hand back to Melissa to allow you to answer those. But what was the things that you felt you didn't learn at IDS and you wish you had? You know, you've been very complimentary. What would you say now development practitioners and students and those who are engaged in the degree that you did, what would you have liked to have learned? What are the big things that you thought, oh my gosh, I wish I'd studied that, or I wish this is the thing that should be being taught there now? So I'll hand back to Melissa. You can answer if you like, or reflect on the other questions. But thank you so much. It's such an honor to meet you virtually, and I hope maybe at COP26 we'll get to see you and look forward to Costa Rica, you know, playing once again the pioneering role that it has played for 25 years in the climate negotiations. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you so much, Farhana. That was a wonderful discussion, and thank you very much, Mr. President, for responding so fulsomely. So we've now got a lot of really good questions and comments coming from the audience. And what I'm going to try and do is take them in some really small groups, because some of them fit together. So I'll indicate a few questions and then perhaps ask you to come back on a group of them, if that's all right. So the first little set is continuing this discussion about climate and environment, where I think people are immensely impressed to hear about what Costa Rica has been doing. So we've got one question from Rebecca Hawkins, who says, as well as decarbonisation, Costa Rica has been a leader of articulating nature and biodiversity as part of a green recovery. So how do you plan to do this? A little bit more about those aspects of Costa Rica's policy. Then Santiago Martinez wants to know a little bit more about how you envisage the relationship between environmental and social justice, and we've been talking about both, especially regarding perhaps the protection of indigenous nations' territories, or the relationship with green energy. So we know that sometimes environmental protection can be unjust and can dispossess people. So how do you seek to balance those things? And then there's a third sort of environmental question from Tangela Drishti, who is interested to know about policies for dealing with plastic pollution, plastic waste pollution, which is, again, I think an issue you've been very active on. And in particular, whether the COVID response has worsened this problem because of the plastic waste pollution coming from PPE and other kinds of waste. So a bit more about how Costa Rica is dealing with this side effect of the COVID response, but also with plastic waste more generally. So perhaps your thoughts on those to begin with, that would be wonderful.
Thank you, Melissa. Well, on conservation, and biodiversity, our approach is what we call, and what's been called, the nature-based solutions. So conservation is a key factor in preserving biodiversity and preserving ecosystems. Luckily, decades ago, we started our policies on conservation, and today we can see the results. In the past 40 years, it's been said that we have lost about 50% of the biomass of biodiversity in the world, which is quite frankly scary. But in Costa Rica, we manage through conservation policies to increase the populations of jaguars, which are complex in the change of the biodiversity, turtles, and many other species. And that's basically protecting forest, and with the schemes of payment for environmental services, which we pay, the state pays, and to private owners of forests to preserve it. For the services they provide, ecosystems and biodiversity, water protection, even tourism, which helps it make it sustainable. That's why we focus so much on ecotourism. If you think about a world that's losing their biodiversity, and you have some place in which it's growing, that it becomes an economic opportunity to people to come here as in tourism. But that also presents the challenge of social justice, because it's true. Currently we are working on a bill to pass in Congress to develop a new right, because during the 70s and the 80s, when most of the conservation policy was declared, it only just like fell from the sky. and it fell on top of many people that were landowners or used to have some kind of being on the land but not have the legal rights on it. So we're building this bill to create a new right, which is a right of environmental protection and use. Basically to have people protect the land in which we are, in which they are, but being able, for example, to use it, to inherit it to their children, to go to the bank, to have a loan using that, but in understanding that that land must be used for environmental purposes and only can be intervened with a specific plan. But that we're doing to include people. And in plastics, we were about to launch our strategy on residues at the beginning of this year, which is prepared with local governments and with many strategies from compost to plastic to even to more modern landfills, the whole set of things. But well, then COVID came along, and COVID has put in pause many important policies. And on the other hand, we were not prepared on handling all, for example, all the masks and all the products that are being used in hospitals for protection. So that's going to be quite a challenge. We were focused on plastic bottles and changing those, but now this is a new normal, a new pollution that we need to tackle, and we were not ready for that.
Yeah. Okay. Wonderful. So there's just one more question in the climate change area that I'd really love your thoughts on, Mr. President. This comes from Peter Newell here at Sussex, who says Costa Rica has led the way in leaving fossil fuels in the ground by agreeing to ban oil exploration. Could you imagine Costa Rica leading something like a Powering Past Fossil Fuels coalition towards a multilateral agreement to keep fossil fuels in the ground, something like a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty? Great to have your thoughts on that one.
Well, I love that one. Actually, we were part of the massive destruction guns or weapons non-proliferation coalition a couple of years ago. And I believe that stands with our DNA. We do believe in that. There's been a ban by executive decree for the past years, which I extended, I believe, until 2050, but any president that comes could change that. So one of the things we're going to do next year, coming out of COVID, is to push for the bill to ban the exploration and exploitation of fossil fuels. And my approach is that the best way of leading is leading by example. So we want to have that as a law in order to push it further, to go. What I've seen is our strength in the international arena is moral power. We do not have a great land extension, but then you can say, if we can do this, why can't others do it? And they say, well, the excuse of scale, and I don't believe the scale is an excuse. If you can do it I remember in my time in IDS, I read the Small is Beautiful book, but I believe that if you have many smalls putting them together, then you have a big one. And I believe that that's what's required to happen. So yeah. I will take the idea for consideration.
Okay, fantastic. So there are a few questions coming up about social protection and protecting people's livelihoods. And I wonder if I might share these with you. So Vince Chipatuka, who is based in Zambia, says COVID-19 has demonstrated to the whole world that social protection mechanisms are important, especially to the developing countries like Costa Rica and Zambia, where he's from. I would actually say it's also shown them to be important in European countries and everywhere. So what message might you have about how countries could achieve sustainable social protection financing mechanisms? how we actually into the future protect people, the resilience of people's livelihoods against shocks like COVID or possibly climate change related shocks. And then there's another related question, which asks what your thoughts are on universal basic income as one route to social protection. A lot of discussion of this as one strategy around the world. Is this something that's also in discussion in Costa Rica, the idea of a basic income that all citizens might have?
Yes, well, on the first question, I do believe that the way to go for developing countries is to have universal healthcare systems. And that sounds very easy, but it's very complex. We had the luck that 80 years ago, and that's 80 years ago, in Costa Rica, it was declared a universal healthcare system. So we have a unified healthcare system with 23 national hospitals, several hundred clinics, and more than 1,500 local units within a unitary system. So, and it's based on the contributions on formal labor, formal work. So that's so it's workers and entrepreneurs who finance the system. So it's very complex, but I believe developing countries, if they want to have a sustainable healthcare system, universal, we need to work on formalizing the labor system. And now it's going to be more difficult because of the digital era. It's going to be because the labor force and the labor market is changing very fast, and it's moving more into informality. But yes, I do believe in universal healthcare because I think it's one of the key for success. In the case of Costa Rica, it's one of our keys. We have our life expectancy is higher than many developed countries because of our system. And also on the minimum, let's say, la renta universal, we say in Spanish. The thing is, for example, in many countries in Latin America, that might be helpful, but many of the countries, we do not have the fiscal margin to implement that. One thing I suggest, if I was a practitioner in development, let's say, not a politician, but well, I did in my country as a practitioner and a politician, is first, my suggestion is to introduce a single number ID for citizens. And why is that? Because with that, you have traceability. And with that, in a universal system, you can work the populations, particularly the poor and vulnerable populations, with traceability. Also using artificial intelligence and data analysis. And you can do the cash transfer, but also you can provide other services. So I believe that's the way to go.
Okay, excellent. So turning sort of moving towards the end to some questions about some of the really extraordinary things Costa Rica has done, and back to some questions about your own leadership. So a couple of people would really like to know a little bit more about your country's extraordinary position in the world around defense spending. So Reinhard Hoss asks, do you think that the overall positive role of Costa Rica in international development is linked to the fact that Costa Rica has no national army? It is one of the few countries in the world, he adds, without a national army, and this fact isn't very well known. And then Laila Mehta, who's one of our colleagues at IDS, asks, how might Costa Rica influence other countries in both the global north and the south to reduce or even eliminate their spend on defense and instead spend that money on the public good, as well as social and environmental concerns? And she adds, this is particularly apt for the UK, where our own defence budget has actually gone up by £16 billion during this last week, at the same time as there are threats about cutting the aid budget. So this is a very live issue, and it would be actually, I think, before we move on to the other questions, just your thoughts on this one.
Actually, it comes first, the abolition of the army, and it's afterwards that you have the human development. It was in the decade of the 40s that we implemented the universal healthcare, the first national university, the University of Costa Rica, was created, the labor code, and afterwards it came the abolition of the army, all in the decade of the 40s. In that time, life expectancy in Costa Rica was about 45 years. It was really low. But afterwards, when you stop spending on the military, you open your margin to expand in other things like education. And that became a key for our development, expanding in health and education. But also there was a political externality, let's say, that whenever you have conflict and you do not have an army, you do not solve your difference by using the army. Then you need the system by its institutions to come up with solutions. So our institutions and our democratic institutions became more robust, more strong, because there was no army to solve things. And the division between powers and the respect of institutions and democracy became very strong. So it's a matter of you spend your money in more important things as education instead of the military, and then your institutions became more robust. So yeah, I encourage every country to do this, but then it's leading by example.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So finally, turning to a few more questions about your leadership. So our colleague at IDS, Hubert Schmitz, asked, how do you persuade people of policies that they might find unpopular? So that's one. Then Vanessa Dubuisson asks, you mentioned in your lecture that you felt being engaged at a political level, at a high level, even the top level, was the best way to affect change. So do you feel also that grassroots movements have a role in affecting change? And what might be the relationship between the formal political system and perhaps these more bottom-up grassroots social movements? And then finally, Marjorie Fernandez says, I really appreciate your perspective on the need for values, empathy and love and so on in the approach to tackle development issues. Unfortunately, there are very few people like you who can actually contribute to tackling development problems who share this perspective. And I think that's very much true. So she asks, how can more people be influenced to acquire and practice this kind of perspective? And can influencing the education system be one way to start on this process? And I suppose that would also be asking you to perhaps finish by reflecting back on the role that your own education in IDS, but perhaps learning through life has had on the perspectives and values that you've acquired. So 3 about politics and leadership, just to finish off with.
Thank you, Melissa. And also thanks to Hubert Schmidt. He was, I worked with him my last dissertation. So I really thank him for that. And also to many people in IDS that I really learn a lot, Robert Chambers, Sir Richard Jolly, James Prescott, who used to be in receiving my papers, great memories of the time. Well, it's complicated. When you work from grassroots, for example, or activism, the good thing is you can be very straightforward about your position. You can communicate. You can advocate. But and that's great. I mean, you feel really free about it. But at the end, you not necessarily have the A to approve if you're in the executive. and then you have to persuade lots of people in a democratic competition. So I believe that it's another front, and there are several fronts you could do that. My approach was that if in the level of politics, you need to get involved, because politics is tough. It's very tough. I mean, it's not nice. People can be really mean sometimes. It's tough on the body. It's tough on the mind. It's tough on the soul. People can be very nasty sometimes. And that's why you need people with empathy and love to get involved. That's why at the beginning of the lecture, from my experience, the most empathic people and the many practitioners with the best intentions and very smart people, scientists and soil scientists, sometimes don't get involved because it's very complex. I mean, it's a sacrifice. The thing you get out of it is you can make a difference from the democratic institutions. Also, it's different from activism because sometimes you need to make exchanges, political exchanges, for things to happen. It's not always the way you want. Things are not always the way you want. You need to negotiate with opposition and with others. For example, just a couple of weeks ago, I had to veto a law on fisheries. There was this kind of fishery when they drag shrimp from the bottom of the seas, but it destroys ecosystems. And as it destroys ecosystems, I had to veto that law. But then all the fishermen and women from a particular province, they were not really happy with me because of it, because they see it from the side of employment. So it can be complicated. Communicating appropriately, it's key also. But we live in times that communications are not that straightforward. I mean, you have to compete with fake news, people that take false information as their reality. It's not easy to, I mean, communications is central for changing behavior, for persuading, also for building love and empathy. Communication is key. It's the way we approach between humans. So we should not disregard communications at all.
Okay. Well, I think that's probably about the time that we need to stop, but also a very appropriate note to finish on. What an inspiring talk and discussion. I must say, this has really ticked every possible box from my point of view. It's quite extraordinary, really. At IDS earlier this year, we launched our strategy for the next period. And in it, we talk about major commitments to tackling climate and environmental justice, to addressing extreme inequities, to fostering health and well-being in its broadest sense, and to shaping more inclusive and accountable societies. And your talk this evening has touched on all of those issues, and also fundamentally about how interconnected they are, and how in this moment of beginning to look towards a post-pandemic transformative world, perhaps there's some optimism that we can actually bring these things together in some new visions for the future. But one of the other key strands in our strategy is about building future leadership for development. And that's where I think your talk today has really shown us in the most inspiring way possible why leadership matters and actually what it takes to be a leader. And this is not just about knowing things. It's not just, although it is partly about science and knowledge and facts, but it's also about some really critical values: courage, empathy, love, something we do talk about a lot at IDS, and actually you've really drawn out its importance. Empathy and the ability, the courage to step up and act, and act according to one's beliefs. And frankly, I can't imagine a more important and inspiring set of messages for all of our students at this point, but actually for all of us. And although your talk has touched on the importance of young people and of the next generation, actually these are messages that are important to all of us, whatever stage and age we might be at in our careers. So I can't thank you enough, Mr. President. This has been really fantastic. And thank you also very much to Farhana for a really stimulating discussion, which has taken us a lot further. Of course, in a different year, we would now be adjourning to the IDS bar or to reception for some celebratory drinks, for some more informal conversation, and probably on to a lovely dinner somewhere. We can't do that, but I want to send you the warmest virtual celebratory hugs and love and thanks, and to say that I very much hope that the next time we meet, it will be in person. And the invitation to you, Mr. President, to come back to IDS in Sussex, to visit all of us face to face, is always there. And I very much hope that within the next year, we can turn that vision and hope into reality. So everybody, thank you so much. Please join me in an online clap and a thanks. And just to let everybody know that this wonderful evening talk and discussion will be available as a recording for anybody who wants to hear it. It'll be on our website. So please spread the word, because I think everybody needs to hear the messages that we have heard today. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Thank you, IDS. Thank you, everyone, especially our sign interpreters.